They don't show up with fangs. They show up with compliments, with chaos, with a gaze that makes you feel chosen until you're emptied. Smart people attract them most, not because you're weak, because you're wired to heal what you didn't break. This video isn't just a warning, it's a weapon, because these 7 energy vampires don't just drain your time. They distort your genius until it serves their survival. You're about to name them, and once you do, they can't hide behind good intentions anymore. Now, have you ever walked away from someone, calm on the outside, but gutted underneath? Not furious, not even sad, just vacant, as if something sacred had been siphoned through a smile. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, but it was real. Sometimes it's the friend who turns every check-in into a confessional, the coworker who praises your brilliance, then presents it as their own, the lover who turns boundaries into betrayal, the sibling who turns your compassion into currency. They come in all forms, some charm, some cry, some just linger, but they all share one thing, a talent for leaving you unsure. Were you just kind, or were you just harvested? This isn't about villains, it's about archetypes. Patterns that dress up as closeness, then feed on your unguarded brilliance. They don't just drain your day, they rewire your worth. And the sharper you are, the more they're drawn to you, not because you're weak, but because your strength is leaking through over-explaining, over-listening, over-performing emotional labor just to feel anchored. Because if you're smart and empathic, you don't just notice the fracture in the room. You think you're supposed to hold it together, but here's the rupture. Not everyone who feels safe around you is safe for you. And until you learn the difference, your intellect becomes a beacon, your presence an offering. You'll attract noise dressed as need, confession disguised as intimacy, and you'll mistake emotional flooding for connection. They won't always ask. Some take with compliments, some with wounds that won't clot, some just with presence so porous its silence is your own. And when you feel hollow, you will say, they didn't mean to, but harm doesn't need malice, only access. And that's what you gave. Not because you're naive, but because your discernment was punished as cruelty. You were told kindness means availability. You were trained to confuse boundaries with betrayal. But real connection doesn't bypass your intuition. It honors it. You weren't built to absorb everyone. You were built to detect. And that detection isn't judgment, it's wisdom. So in this video, we won't hand you red flags. We'll hold up mirrors. We'll name the psychic archetypes that feed off brilliance, not to blame them, but to reclaim you. Because these archetypes don't steal your energy. You trade it for peace, for praise, for belonging. But once you see the cost, you'll stop paying. There are 7, and they all know how to bypass logic and speak straight to your patterns. But by the end of this, you'll know their names, and you'll stop leaking. Stay here. It won't be soft, but it will be sovereign. Let's begin. Yeah, you didn't just get tired. You fragmented. Not all at once, not loudly, but slowly, through micro withdrawals from your own center. It began the first time you smiled to avoid confrontation, the first time you nodded instead of naming, the first time your body screamed no, but your lips whispered of course. Each moment seemed harmless, necessary, strategic, but the psyche tracks every betrayal, especially the ones you commit against yourself. You called it survival, but your nervous system called it abandonment, and your soul, it called it exile. Because when your boundaries dissolve in the name of being understood, you don't just lose energy, you lose coherence. The sense that your thoughts, your body, your being are a unified field. Instead, they scatter into performance, appeasement, vigilance. And you feel it. That low hum of fatigue that no sleep cures. That subtle resentment toward everyone no one, that ache beneath your brilliance, like you've become a lighthouse for others but blind to yourself. They praise your insight, but insight becomes pathology when it's never returned. Because every time you explain, absorb, translate, interpret, you make the world digestible for them. But who translates you? Who makes you digestible to yourself? This is not burnout. This is psychic bleed, the kind that doesn't show up in medical charts, but in how you shrink before you speak, how you rehearse safety instead of presence, how your face smiles but your eyes search for exits. You've trained yourself to be useful, so useful that people forget you have needs, so helpful that they never think to help you, so clear that they assume you're invincible. But clarity is not invulnerability, it's exposure, and without protection, it becomes erosion. This is where the ego fractures, not when it's challenged, but when it's used as scaffolding for others' comfort. You become their map, their compass, their mirror. But who holds you? Who reminds you that your insight is not a public utility, that your brilliance is not a balm for every open wound, that your mind was not made to interpret emotional weather patterns no one else will name? The answer is silence, and you've forgotten how to hear it, because the silence inside you has been overwritten by echoes of other people's fears. Now, when you sit alone, you don't rest, you ruminate, you replay, you scan for signals that aren't there. That's the cost of psychic enmeshment. Your intuition gets replaced by their projections. You start pre-decoding every room. You begin conversations in defense. You enter relationships already bracing for demand. And slowly, you stop initiating. You stop revealing. You stop asking. Because somewhere along the line, you decided it's safer to be needed than to be seen. But the need never ends. It expands. It adapts. It weaponizes your empathy against you. They don't call it dependence. They call it closeness. But what they crave is your containment, your predictable performance of care, your willingness to disappear just enough so they can feel whole. And the more you comply, the more invisible you become, not just to them, to yourself. That's what emotional collapse looks like. Not chaos, not breakdown, but quiet compliance. The kind that erases its own edges to avoid rejection. The kind that stays in the room, even when your soul is clawing at the door. This is the moment you mistake exhaustion for maturity. That's the ego's final trick, to convince you that silence is strength, when in fact it's suppression. You start speaking in disclaimers. You start thinking in edits. You begin to disappear preemptively, just to avoid confrontation. But here's the truth you've buried beneath all that intellect. You're not exhausted because you're too sensitive. You're exhausted because you're not being received. You're not overwhelmed because you're weak. You're overwhelmed because you're unmirrored. And no amount of intellect can substitute for intimacy, the real kind, the kind that doesn't feed off you but feeds you. That's what we find next. Not the fantasy of being understood, but the weaponization of being useful. The illusion that says, if I'm smart enough, kind enough, useful enough, they won't leave. But what if that's the lie that's draining you? What if your worth has been hijacked by archetypes that mirror need, but reject depth? That ache behind your eyes? It isn't fatigue. It's the pressure of unspoken patterns crowding your psyche. You've been devoured by designs that wear human faces. Now we give those designs names, not to judge, but to sever the spell. They don't walk in with demands. They arrive as familiarity. Some of them aren't draining you. They're mirroring the parts of you that still want to be drained, as need shaped like intimacy, as crisis dressed in coincidence, as reverence that turns to reliance, then rot. These are not people, they are patterns. psychic parasites that know how to disguise consumption as connection. And if you felt drained, without cause, without rupture, without event, it's because you didn't meet an individual. You met an archetype. But before you think you've just been too nice, ask yourself, why do you keep attracting confession without confession in return? Let's name them. The confessional. They don't speak to be understood. They speak to offload. Every encounter is a monologue soaked in urgency. Your silence isn't respected. It's harvested. You know this one. The co-worker who corners you with wide eyes and a shaky voice, unloading their chaos into your lunch break. You nod, you absorb, you try to care, but when you finally speak, your words vanish into the air like vapor because they weren't listening, they were purging. This isn't dialogue, it's data extraction. You are the vault they never intend to fill. Now ask yourself, how many times have you mistaken emotional dumping for intimacy? The mimic. They reflect you until you start to fade. They echo your ideas, your tone, your essence, but offer no original signal. Watch the way they study your phrasing, how they repurpose your insights online, how their admiration slowly becomes replication, not because they want to become you, but because they want your effect. They want the glow you create in others. They want your resonance without your refinement. This isn't flattery, it's consumption by camouflage. But here's the twist. What if they're not copying you? What if they're copying the part of you that still wants approval? The perpetual patient. They are always in crisis, always one insight away from healing, always needing just a bit more of your bandwidth. They show up gently, apologetically even. I don't want to be a burden, they say, before pouring another hour of emotional hemorrhage into your lap. Their humility is a mask. Their gratitude is currency. Your time becomes their sanctuary and eventually their entitlement. This isn't healing, it's hostage negotiation with a wound that doesn't want to close. The real question isn't why they're still broken, it's why you still need to be the one holding the bandage. The inverted mentor. They pedestal you, then deconstruct you. They arrive with praise but lace it with lessons. You've seen it in the seasoned professional who says, "You've got talent," then immediately critiques your tone, your depth, your speed. They offer guidance that dilutes, advice that domesticates, and all the while, they position themselves not to uplift, but to contain. This isn't guidance, it's grooming. This isn't flattery, it's containment disguised as counsel. And the next question is, why did you need their permission to begin with? The passive puppet master. They never ask. They imply. They never demand. They evoke guilt. They wrap obligation in suggestion. A sigh instead of a statement. A guilt-laced, "it's fine" when you assert yourself. Suddenly, you're editing your availability to appease someone who never had to ask directly. You carry the weight of their emotional world without invitation because the cost of saying no feels like betrayal. This isn't support, it's seduction through self-erasure. The betrayal didn't begin when they manipulated you. It began the moment you made guilt your compass. The earnest mirror. They admire you, they adore you, until you confront them. They said you inspired them. They hung on your every word, until the moment you spoke a truth they weren't ready to hear. Then the worship cracked. Now you're arrogant, unavailable, unsafe. They weren't loving you, they were projecting onto you, and you fractured the fantasy. This isn't love, it's worship with a trigger finger. You weren't being admired, you were being imagined, and then punished for shattering the story. The sacred wound. They are the unhealed identity. They wear their trauma like royalty. They brand themselves with their pain. They signal depth through damage. But the moment you challenge the narrative, the moment you suggest growth instead of glorification, they retreat. They don't want healing, they want reverence. And if your insight doesn't coddle their pain, it becomes an attack. This isn't vulnerability. It's weaponized pain disguised as authenticity. But the wound isn't sacred because it hurts. It's sacred because it still controls them. And maybe you felt strong when you named them. You felt sovereign when you saw the pattern. You thought clarity was closure, but awareness isn't a shield. It's an opening. And now the real work begins. Because they weren't feeding on your ignorance, they were feeding on your participation. So you name them, you label them, you think you're free, but naming the parasite doesn't remove the wound that let it in. Now pause, not to feel anger, to feel clarity. These archetypes don't want your power. They want your compromise, your softening, your translation. Because once your genius becomes understandable, it becomes usable. And what they love most isn't your depth. It's their access to it. But your energy is not communal property. Your presence is not a public resource. And your intelligence is not a prize for those unwilling to meet their own mirror. You don't have to fight them. You don't have to warn them. You don't even have to name them aloud. Just stop leaking the moment you see the pattern. You interrupt the spell, not through conflict, through containment. This isn't revenge. It's return, not into performance, into presence too silent to seduce, too whole to harvest. And when the mirror disappears, the masks panic. Let them, because what comes next is the part where you stop explaining your exit and start embodying your absence. You've seen them, not as people, as archetypes, as strategies wrapped in skin. And now you stop participating, because awareness without withdrawal is just self-aware enslavement. So now we cut, not with violence, with absence, not with malice, with silence. You don't explain your exit. You don't offer closure. You don't translate your boundary into softer language. You disappear from the script, because the role they cast you in was never yours. You don't ghost them. You ghost the part of you that needed to be chosen by them. This is not detachment from others. It's detachment from the performance. You withdraw the currency they fed on. Your emotional labor, your strategic empathy, your calibrated brilliance. You become still, heavy, undecorated. They will notice. They will fidget. They will call it ego. It's not. It's equilibrium. You've exited the emotional marketplace, where your insight was bartered for belonging, where your clarity was monetized in attention, where your presence was mined for healing you never owed. And now, you've become unaffordable. You no longer translate your intuition. You honor it. You no longer dilute your knowing into safety. You let it stand unedited. You no longer edit your expression to protect their projection. You let the weight of your silence speak what words cannot hold. And when they say you've changed, they're right. Because sovereignty always looks like distance to those who feed on proximity. You no longer offer mirrors. You offer silence. And silence, it doesn't flatter. It reveals. It shows them who they are without your interpretation. It shows you who you were without their distortion. You stop being the interpreter of their chaos. You stop being the stage for their unraveling. You stop being the balm for wounds that bleed by choice. Now, when someone speaks, you don't rush to decode. You measure their presence before their pain. You listen for manipulation in the melody, not just the message. Because not every cry is a call for help. Some are rehearsals of helplessness, some are hooks, and you no longer bite. This is the death of obligation masquerading as love. This is the burial of performance dressed as presence. You move differently now, not faster, but with weight. You arrive in rooms and no longer scan for tension to soothe. You don't reach, you don't nod. You let the discomfort sit because it was never yours to solve. They called you empathic. What they meant was compliant. They called you intuitive. What they meant was exploitable. But now, you've burned the script. You no longer light up for attention. You no longer flinch at disapproval. You no longer need your absence explained or your silence justified. You let them wonder. You let them retell the story in ways that soothe their guilt. You let them mythologize your exit because you know your departure is the mirror they refused to face while you were still present. Let them say you're cold. Let them say you're different. Let them say nothing at all, because your absence is not void, it's verdict. And the verdict is this: you are no longer accessible to energies that confuse consumption with closeness. You are no longer flattered by being needed. You are nourished by being whole. You are not the savior. You are not the script. You are the sovereign. And now you don't respond. You resonate. What happens when the mirror doesn't just shatter, but vanishes? When there's no more reflection to manage, no more role to perform, no more stage to hold? That's not abandonment. That's arrival. And the self that steps forward now isn't new. It's just finally undeniable. And you didn't outgrow them. You outgrew the version of you that needed them. That needed to be understood, to be translated, to be tolerated by energies that only ever loved you for what you made them feel, not for what you actually are. Now you stand at the edge of that old performance, not with sorrow, with silence, because when the mirror leaves the room, the illusions start to starve, and what remains is not loneliness, it's liberation. You were never meant to be available to everyone. Your genius was never designed to be decoded by the uninitiated. Your clarity was never meant to be absorbed by those who refuse to see themselves. So now, you don't perform your insight. You embody it. You don't explain your worth. You anchor it. You don't prove your integrity. You become the consequence of it. They can't reach you now, not because you've built walls, but because you've become atmosphere. And atmosphere doesn't speak, it alters. This is what it means to complete the cycle, not by returning with a better argument, but by never returning at all. You don't give updates, you don't drop breadcrumbs, you don't soften the transformation for the ones who mistook your light for a spotlight. They called you heavy, cold, aloof, but heaviness is not absence, it's arrival. And coldness, it's clarity without accommodation. You've ceased being a mirror. You've become the flame. And flames don't reflect, they purify. This is the moment your silence becomes their reckoning, where the echo of your absence begins revealing everything your presence used to protect them from. They'll remember your words now, not because they were beautiful, but because they burned. They'll remember your pauses, not because they were polite, but because they revealed. And they'll remember your exit, not as a door closed, but as a mirror broken, because they weren't relating to you. They were relating to the part of you that refused to abandon them. And that part is gone, not dead, integrated. You didn't become untouchable, you became unshakable. And now you walk through rooms without leaking. You speak without seeking. You love without lowering. Because you no longer offer yourself as proof. You offer yourself as presence. You are not a warning. You are the consequence they summon when they treat clarity as a commodity. You are not the lesson. You are the result. And the result is non-negotiable. There is no doorway back into the version of you that begged to be seen. There is no password that grants access to a self that no longer exists. There is no apology that will resurrect the mirror, because you've become the flame. And flames don't explain. They end what can't withstand them. So now let the stories be told. Let the myths be made. Let them say you changed. Because you did. You stopped performing resonance. You started enforcing reality. And that shift, that's not ego, That's evolution. You don't return to explain. You return to end the performance, not with noise, but with presence too still to distort. You used to light up the room. Now you burn through it, and in the ash, only the truth remains. They didn't love you. They fed on you, and you let them. Not because you were weak, but because you were starving for someone to see you and stay. Now you see yourself, and you stay. That isn't healing. That's homecoming. Not to the version they remember, to the one they never met. No applause, no final word. Just wait, just presence, just silence, heavy enough to end the spell. You didn't need more healing. You needed less participation in what kept reopening the wound. This wasn't a transformation, it was a return. Not to who they remember, to who they never met. You're no longer reacting, you're revealing. No longer translating, you're becoming the language itself. And if they still wonder what changed, let them. Because from here on, your silence is the boundary. Your presence is the consequence. And your withdrawal, it's not rejection, it's revelation. Now pause, Tucky, and answer this. Which part of you was performing just to be needed? Name it. Without dressing it up, write it in the comments. Not to be validated, but to bury the mask. Because the world doesn't just misread minds like yours, it rewrites them. Until your presence becomes their performance and your intelligence is harvested, just to keep the system running. Stay here, because next, we expose the design, not the obvious attack, the elegant erosion, where brilliance isn't silenced. It's softened, refined until it forgets its edge, honored until it forgets its hunger. They won't destroy your genius. They'll applaud it into obedience. Watch what happens when intelligence becomes palatable, not to preserve it, to control it. Click before your clarity learns to behave.